culinary or even historical perspective. But it seems that in these two sources, one source wanted to give an historical reason for the matzot, which means connected to the Exodus, and another source was repeating a tradition of a pre-existing spring festival where, for generations perhaps, matzot was already a part of this communal dinner. So I want to speak very briefly about what I'll call the original matzot, not the matzot of the journey out, again, which I don't think is entirely credible, but the matzot in the first description. Why would matzot be part of this dinner, this meal, that the community would gather around, eat the paschal lamb, the matzot, and the maror? I've taught this many times, just want to repeat it again. By the way, the source is Theodore Gaster, Festivals of the Jewish Year, Theodore Gaster, Festival of the Jewish Year. He says, very briefly, the reason you eat the paschal lamb and you make sure to burn it till morning, so none of the meat goes rotten. The meal of the community where God is present has to be a meal of purity. Therefore, we need to be in a state of purity, and the food needs to be in a state of purity. What is matzah? Unleavened bread does not go bad. If you put matzah in the cupboard, you come back a year later, it'll still be matzah. Not so with bread. So the origin of matzah seems to be that it was in a meal of purity where the meat couldn't go bad. The matzah was pure from leaven that eventually can rot the bread. Maror as a purgatory, which means anything that was that could turn into putrefaction was burnt, as it were, out of the intestines. And of course, we needed to be in a pure state. That probably was an antecedent festival, and the exodus from Egypt occurred at the same time, because remember, Moses was originally asking Pharaoh that we might go out into the desert to observe our festival to God. So there was a pre-existent festival that the Exodus was then layered on top of. And if one reads this very carefully, you can tease out what we'll call the original festival from the historical festival commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. All right, this concludes my little Judaism 101 talk for this morning on Exodus chapter 12. And now I want to go on to my main topic for today, a continuation of my talk last night, which is on this complex problem of spiritual liberation. As I mentioned last night, as I review things I've taught over the years, I'm beginning to look back and sometimes even doubt if I knew exactly what I was talking about, and maybe I should give a little bit of an update or something. So I've come to doubt the utility of the term spiritual liberation. I'm not even sure if it's a useful term. I don't think we can get rid of the term. It is so much a part of the inner life tradition of Judaism. But I want to tease out a little bit, to analyze a little bit what that means so that we can both understand what it might mean and also to make use of it. Remember, my focus is not just that we know the history of the ritual, we know the rituals themselves, the symbolic, conceptual, thematic dimensions, but also how we actually use them for our own transformative work. Now, I think spiritual liberation as a modern idea of modern Western spirituality probably has to do with more of an Eastern religion idea, that one can actually break the cycle of rebirth, reincarnation, adjust one's karma so that you are let out of the cycle of the liberation is from the liberation of the cycle of birth and death, where the soul, as it were, is freed. There's another sense of spiritual liberation, was a dramatic breakthrough, almost like the Christian idea of grace, a fundamental shift in one's being, in one's personality. One is, as it were, enlightened, liberated. One becomes, as it were, wise. Now, from my perspective, I don't think there is a moment of complete liberation, of enlightenment, or achieving pure wisdom in some kind of static sense. I do think we can live lives where we become more wise than we used to be, and wise enough to have what I call sound judgment. So as we move toward transforming Or HaTorah from a synagogue to a wisdom institute, of course, you're all very, very warmly invited to be part of this. I think you'll love what we're going to be doing. I've been thinking about how to define the word wisdom. And so I'm looking at when people say, well, that was a very wise thing to do, or that was a wise thing to say, or that was very wise not to do that, or not to say that. At a very simple level, wisdom means we're using sound judgment, either in just something that has no moral dimension, maybe an interpersonal dimension, or even in a moral dimension. So one thing I will be talking about in some of our the initial talks that we will upload to the Wisdom Institute teaching site, and I'll probably put on Instagram, maybe TikTok as well, is all the elements of sound judgment. I'll postpone that to either next week or we'll put a link in my Instagram. But I want to go to from a Passover perspective, from a Jewish spiritual psychological perspective, this idea of liberation. First of all, connecting to Passover. The main inner life teaching rooted in the Kabbalah and Chassidut of liberation is actually not the liberation of the Israelites, which is the more biblical idea of political liberation from Pharaoh, but liberation of God from exile. There's a term called Galut Hadibur, which is the exile of the word. This is a fascinating Kabbalistic idea that the dibur, you might say, the revelatory dimension of divine speech, in this realm gets obstructed, gets lost, gets darkened, becomes unavailable. So as God, as it were, sends a dibur, an aspect of divine revelation into this world, but it becomes trapped in darkness. And therefore, people don't have access to the dibur. So from the Hasidic Kabbalistic perspective, it is the dibur that is in exile, called Galut HaDibur, the exile of the word. And it is our job to, as it were, bring dibur out of exile. So interestingly, the Israelites in the spiritual narrative are not in Egypt. The dibur, the revelatory dimension of the divine, is in Egypt. We function as Moses and God. We are the ones who have to release dibur from Egypt. How do we release dibur from Egypt? Well, of course, this is going to go directly to Kabbalistic Hasidic spiritual psychology. The dibur is lost in you. The dibur is occluded, is darkened in your inner life, which means in every one of us there is an Egypt. In every one of us, the dibur is in exile, and we all have the capacity, at least theoretically, to release the dibur from exile, at least incrementally, at least one stage at a time. Now, those of you who have been studying Lurianic Kabbalah with me can already see this maps directly on the Kabbalistic idea of the klipot, the spark and the husk. That there is a spark of divine light scattered throughout our realm and in our inner lives. It is darkened, it is encased in husks, klipot, and part of the life of the human being is to break the klipot and release divine sparks. So yes, these ideas are utterly similar. You might say it's even the same idea, just using different metaphors. Now, why would we have different metaphors for the same idea? So why do we have poems about the same idea? It's interesting that I believe that metaphoric, poetic language is actually the natural language of the soul, and therefore a religious tradition with a spiritual dimension will always be looking for metaphors to express what I'll call a pre-linguistic truth. So there are truths within us that are not yet linguistically articulated. You might say the truth exists in a pre- or meta-linguistic way. And one of the things that we human beings do is look for the poetic images, the mythic images, the metaphors that somehow articulate that truth. And I don't think there is a limit on the kind of metaphors. The main question of a metaphor is, does it work? So when I hear the divine is in exile within me, that means something to me. Another person might say, that means nothing to me. I don't get it. I can't be how God could be in exile. I don't understand how God could be in exile in me. Well, then don't use that metaphor. You find a more useful metaphor. But the Kabbalistic Hasidic spiritual psychology in many ways rests on the metaphor of the spark covered by a husk and the dibur being in exile in Egypt, and we, human beings, being the ones responsible for breaking the husk or releasing the divine, the dibur from Egypt through our own inner work. So the only way that we can break the husks, the only way that we can, as it were, release the dibur from galut in Egypt is our work. So now we go to the question of spiritual liberation, not that somehow I become liberated. Think about the difference. From a Kabbalistic, Hasidic perspective, I don't become liberated, I liberate God. It's a strange idea. Now one can say it's effectively the same idea, probably, but you don't get it from completely clearing your mind. So if one thing, and again, I don't say I know enough Eastern religion to say this with complete confidence, but from what I've read, there is a goal in Eastern meditation to completely clear the mind so that the mind becomes, as it were, pure of human thought, human concerns, and so on. The times that I've done those meditations, it's been like experiencing one divine note or one divine color, or a space completely devoid of all human thought. There are Kabbalistic meditations that go that way, but they're only preparatory for the actual work of breaking husks or releasing God. The goal is not emptying the mind. We need to do that now and again to break the grip of the Yetzer Hara on our mentality, on our inner work. So one way to break the grip of the Yetzer Hara is to cleanse one's consciousness. But you cleanse consciousness in order to go back and do the work. So meditation, this kind of meditation, is a tool in our liberating the divine. So what I want to offer, I'll offer a few more words. Although I will use the term spiritual liberation, a lot of people like the term. Among us, I want to define it more using authentic Kabbalistic Hasidic metaphors. We are liberating the divine. So how do we liberate the divine? I want to repeat a few words of what I said last night and then add a few more things for today. When I think of liberating the divine, I try to imagine something of the divine and human consciousness. There's some kind of place where divine consciousness and human consciousness merge. And I think of that as in being the authentic I or the authentic you. Now, when I think about this idea of the authentic human being, I'm thinking of something I read a long time ago. I don't exactly remember where, but I know it really captured my attention, that there's only one I. Aristotle even talks about this when he talks about what it means to use we have a subject and a predicate. And so we have the subject, a person, and the predicate, the person is tall, short, gender, class, race, whatever. There's a predicate describing the person, but there's no predicate that can actually describe the essence of a human being. So when I say I am or I want to be, anything after that is a predicate, a descriptor, that does not describe the essence of the human being. Aristotle talks about it and moves right past it in his discussion of human character, but it's a really interesting idea that there is a you, an I, an essential I that does not have a predicate. It's my pure being, and there's only one of these that will ever exist in the history of the universe. My essential I has only one chance in the history of the universe to achieve its full actualization as a human being. Now, that is a philosophic, but kind of a Heideggerian way, with a bit of Aristotle built in, of articulating this Kabbalistic myth. I only have one chance, this unique I, to do my work in the liberation of God. I have my work to do. I have my part in this work. I have one chance to do it. Because when my life is over, I hand in my spurs. I get ready for my next mission. By the way, I was asked after my entire life, and I go up to the divine, what question would I ask God? And I instinctively said, ready for my next mission. So, if there is reincarnation, rebirth, I just want to get on with my work. Give me another assignment. I'll try to do it better next time. So I hope I have another chance. I think I could do a better job in releasing the divine from Galut and working on my own purity. I'm learning more and more every day. I'm trying to do the work, but I know this is the essence of my life. So therefore, liberation in this sense redounds to the word duty. The duty to as it were, redeem the divine from the galut, from the exile in Egypt, the galut hadibur, as it were, the divine that is trapped in the darkness that is in within me, and as it were, which is the same as the actualization of my inner essence. They become the same thing. This more philosophic idea and the Kabbalistic idea, I think these two metaphors kind of merge. Well, how do we do this? It won't surprise you to think that I think it comes down to the inner work that I've worked into my system called Wisdom Works, but it has to do with developing a higher self, a conscious higher self that has many, many different layers that I've taught about. It has to do with a contemplative practice of examining what I'll call the unconscious ego self. It has to do with the contemplative practice that includes the work on the realm of the soul, where I think spiritual work gets done. So to put it very simply, when I try to imagine the inner life, and of course there's a question, who's the I here talking about this? I can't solve that one today. But try to imagine the main part of your life is what's happening in your unconscious ego self. The unconscious ego self sends up the involuntary thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc., that typically populate our consciousness in the, as it were, initial position. Then there's the person that says, I do not want to live my life based on the involuntary impulses sent up from my unconscious ego self. I want to move to my higher self, and I want to manage my unconscious ego self. Therefore, we become conscious of it. And I, this higher I want to live a life deliberately, meaningfully. I want to lead my life and not have my unconscious ego self lead me. I think that's the first and constant step of the duty of liberating the divine, is that we take responsibility for our lives. We cultivate the what I'll call the higher self for its purpose, A, of connecting to the divine, yes, but more than anything, working on regulating the unconscious ego life so that it does not turn us into its slave. I'll go back to one of my definitions of wisdom. I will never call a dysregulated human being wise. I think a dysregulated human being is incapable of issuing sound judgment. I think a dysregulated person, whether it's dysregulated from anger, resentment, guilt, shame, victim status, an entire panoply of disruptive ego states, any person ensconced in one of those negative ego states is, in my mind, by definition, not in a place where they can become wise. Part of what it means to become wise is to be able, at least momentarily, to separate yourself from disruptive unconscious ego states. This is very difficult lifelong work. By the way, that's one reason I don't think we achieve spiritual liberation, as if one day I don't have to do the work of quieting down my unconscious ego self, all the different aspects of it, and live a conscious, intended life instead of a life ruled by what I'm going to call the will of the unconscious ego self. So for the unconscious ego self, it's willing. In my life, it's involuntary. I don't want to think those thoughts. I don't want to feel those feelings. Sometimes when people say really terrible things, a person says, I don't know why I said that. And well, part of it is the unconscious ego self wills itself into us, and we do things that are not voluntary. If I can just give you the briefest, one of those common examples from my classes in counseling. Anybody who studied with me for more than a minute has heard of the no 4 C's. In general, do not criticize other people. Do not complain about them. Do not condemn, meaning do not use harsh language, and don't allow for escalating conflict. And nearly every counseling case that comes my way between people, it's people who have taken my classes and studied with me and couldn't do it. So, for example, years ago, I was counseling a couple where one person had forgotten something, and the other person got upset, and the other person got really hurt. It's not that big of a deal. Well, to me, it's a big deal. It went round and around. They argued about it. And I said, okay, I really get it. It happens all the time. Somebody disappoints someone else. Your upset is valid. They're an adult. They're responsible. They forget something. It's their fault. I get it. Other than we agreed no criticizing, not only in speech, but also in facial expressions and in gestures. It's such a high bar. It's almost an impossibly high bar. It's not natural. And then I oftentimes say, as something that I heard when I was in rabbinical school, our job is not to be living according to human nature. That's the involuntary dimension of the unconscious ego self. Our job is to be beyond the human nature of living according to the unconscious ego self and live according to a higher nature, which means the dictates of what I'm going to call the higher self. So with this couple, I really went down to what I call freeze framing. So I asked the angry person. In this case, it was the guy, and I said, "Were you angry?" He said, "Well, don't you think?" And he went on with all of the explanations and justifications. I said, "Look, I'm not accusing you. I'm just asking you. When you go back to that very moment, take a breath. Can you remember your anger?" He says, "Yes." So no matter what you said next, did it come out in anger? He said, "Well, I wasn't like shouting." I said, "That wasn't my question." I said, I really want you to go back into your inner life and just try to get in touch with that moment." He said, "Yes, I was angry." And I said, "And what did you say? Why did you forget the whatever it is?" That's called complaining. It's an insincere why question. And he realized it by the numbers. He ended up violating all of the 4 C's. He criticized. He issued unsolicited advice. He complained in an unkind tone of voice. He ended up saying harsh things and engaged in escalating conflict. He got it. He said, "Well, what could I have done?" Those who have taken my wisdom word classes with me, you'll know what the answer is. We cannot not feel anger. We can certainly not speak from it. Everybody knows how not to talk. So if you remember my classes, what do you do when you feel anger? Breathe. Don't talk. Go to a script. In this case, I'm feeling disappointed. It's not about you. Clearly, this is not the most terrible thing that's ever happened to us. We can figure out a way to get past this. But I'm having a tough moment, and it's not about you. I'm in charge of my emotions. And I said to the wife, I said, "How would you have felt had he said that?" She said, "That would have made me feel terrific because I felt demeaned, I felt put down, I felt cut down, and it led to an unnecessary argument." I want to now bring this over to the spiritual psychology of Passover. Now, I didn't say this because I don't want to introduce too much spiritual psychology into wisdom works for people who are working on the basic issues of character development. But now let's think about this. Had I gone that far? Try to imagine in any relationship, the divine is hovering. Now, when the divine is hovering in a relationship, what I mean is that as each person does their own spiritual search for the divine within, that there's moments when individual spiritual searches can meet in a relationship. By the way, I want to say parenthetically, when some people say to me, I don't feel deep intimacy with my partner, and I query, and they have a pretty good relationship, I sometimes say, may I offer a thought? I'm not saying what I'm saying is the right question, but it's a question I have. And here's a conversation I'll sometimes have with a person in counseling. Do you consider yourself to be a spiritual person? Yes. Are you looking for conversations of a spiritual nature with your spouse? Exactly, Rabbi. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Then I say, how much time and effort do you put into your own spiritual development? It's a simple question. Unless a person has really been working a spiritual program, the most typical answer is, I don't even know what that means. That is the most typical answer. I don't even know what that means. Sometimes this person is a church-going Christian or a synagogue-going Jew. They say, my religion gives me nothing. I say, religion gives many things, but the idea of constant, focused spiritual development, inner spiritual growth, typically is not, in most places, I think we're different, in most places is not taught rigorously, didactically. Not that you can achieve spiritual growth by going to a class, but you can be given the tools for spiritual growth. The person said, I wouldn't know how to do that. Sorry, I'm breaking camera etiquette and I'm going for a book. So a few weeks ago, I said we should all be studying, and people said, but Rabbi, what should I study? Start here. The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, 1978. If you don't know what to study and you want to study something, just start here. And one thing I want to do in the Wisdom Institute is give talks on the several books that I have in my library that when I'm feeling in a funk and I'm feeling the blues and I don't feel spiritually connected and I'm not sure of who I am and what I should be doing with my life, there's a small number of books that I go to, including books on spiritual psychology, like this book, The Road Less Traveled, and the subsequent books of M. Scott Peck, by the way. I can't recommend him enough. And of course, books of poetry. So I said to the person who said, I don't have enough spiritual intimacy, I said, how much time do you spend in it? And what do you do? He says, I don't spend any time on it. And so I ventured to guess. You can't have spiritual intimacy with another person if you haven't acted on your own spiritual depth. Because what you end up doing is wanting them to do the spiritual work for you. So sometimes when a person says, I don't feel spiritual intimacy with my spouse, I think what they're saying is, and I've tried this out with great humility because I could be wrong. I said, I'm going to offer you haven't developed your own spiritual depth. And if you develop your own spiritual depth, you would not be relying on your spouse as a source for your spiritual depth. Well, when I've articulated this, I have to say, this could just be anecdotal evidence, in every single case, the person said, you're right. I'm not doing spiritual work. I want something. I'm asking my spouse to give it when I don't even work on it myself. Now, for many people, that's a revelation. They want spiritual intimacy, but they do no spiritual work. So one of the ways that we release the dibur from Egypt, that we allow the authentic you to come into our life, that we break the husk, is commit ourselves to spiritual work. And if you don't know what to do next, start with this. And I will be putting up in videos many, many different sources and techniques for this kind of spiritual growth. I want to go back to the young man in the initial conversation very briefly. Try to imagine that I felt permission to go in this realm. That there's a divine hovering over the two of you. Ideally, one person's doing spiritual work, the other person is doing spiritual work, and then there are opportunities for a true I-you in a Buberian sense of not just two people meeting authentically, and not two people with good character trying to build a relationship, but people with a spiritual connection. And try to imagine when you go into anger in the 4 C's, you're driving the divine out of your life. You're driving the divine back into Egypt. You're putting the divine spark back into a klippah, back into a husk. Now, I hardly ever say this in a basic counseling conversation because I think it's too spiritually loaded. But since we are talking about the connection of what we'll call spiritual liberation, meaning liberating the divine from Egypt or from klippot, and our being agents of that liberation, so now I can say fully, all of the things that I teach about character development, anger, the 4 C's, the virtue practices, the rationality practices, the processing, they're really good tools. They'll make every relationship better. But hovering behind all my teachings is releasing divine sparks from klippot and rescuing the galut hadibur from Egypt and making it part of our consciousness. So I don't think spiritual work and character development and interpersonal work can be separated from each other. All three are entwined. Now, you don't have to be deeply spiritually, consciously, to work on character development and make relationships better. That's good in and of itself. But I want us to realize they are deeply, inherently connected in this idea of spiritual liberation, liberating the divine to, as it were, affect its power in our lives, both our internal lives and our interpersonal lives. All right, that's my address for this morning. And Avigal, I'm inviting but not requiring that you give me any kind of response that you